Hi, I'm Ralph Langner. In this video, you will not learn about new threats to industrial control systems. You will not learn about APTs, TTPs, cyber kill chains, and similar buzzwords. Instead, I will provide some background and context on ICS threat intelligence, which you may find useful when furnishing your OT security strategy. First, we need to discuss what we actually mean when we talk about cyber threats and threat intelligence. Unfortunately, terminology has become quite conflated up to the point where one can get the impression that ICS threat intelligence covers pretty much the whole field of OT security. IT security is a bit more stringent here. As an example, CrowdStrike came up with this useful definition. Threat intelligence is data that is collected, processed, and analyzed to understand a threat actor's motives, targets, and attack behaviors. FireEye defines cyber threat intelligence as evidence-based knowledge about adversaries, their motives, intents, capabilities, enabling environments, and operations. The central theme in both definitions is the threat actor or the adversary, as FireEye calls it. Threats ultimately emerge from human actors because malware, intrusions, and so forth don't produce themselves. Threat intelligence is about the forces behind manifest intrusion and compromise. A threat actor can be a single person, such as a lone hacker or a group or organization. The important thing is that in any case it's about real human beings pursuing their various motives, attempting to achieve certain goals, using certain tactics, employing particular skills, and consuming resources in the process of doing so. In theory, the better you understand threat actors that are relevant for your organization, the better you can defend. That's threat intel theory, and so far it sounds logical. In OT security reality, however, there are three basic things you need to know in order to really understand what threat intelligence can do for you and what it can't. First, discussions about threat actors and their tactics are usually not about real attackers and actual attacks, but about what imagined attacker personas could probably do. Surprise! There are so few actual cyber-physical attacks on the record that it wouldn't suffice for any meaningful empirical investigation about real threat actors and their tactics and tools at large. On rare occasions, the experts frankly admit that their elaborations on threat actors, their identities and capabilities, are not drawn from actual bad guys executing actual cyber-physical attacks.
When you talk about describing the threat, are you talking about the threat as in a threat actor or a type of attack?
Great question. So the answer is that we are not talking about a threat actor.
Apparently, Sergio Caltagirone is talking about tactics and tools that are commonly available as we know it from botnets. However, do we know that the tools and tactics we are discussing here are created and will be used by real-world attackers? Here is Otis Alexander explaining how MITRE built up their knowledge base of attacker tools and techniques for ICS, the famous MITRE attack framework.
As you know, around the 2015, 2016 time frame, we didn't have a lot to show in terms of attacks, but it started to pick up with the Ukrainian attacks and different things like that. So,
well, did it really pick up with the Ukrainian attacks? Probably not as much, as there was only one other cyber-physical attack attempt afterwards, namely the Triconex attack.
I think what we describe as adversary use is a little broader, though. So it's not exactly always what's going on in the wild. It may be what credible red teams are doing. I know within Attack for ICS, I've used one of your documents talking about module firmware that you had released a long time ago. So it seemed pretty credible. So we'll use a number of resources to kind of build out this knowledge base.
I'm not dismissing these efforts. I'm just saying that they probably have less to do with actual intelligence than what most people would expect. Next time you read the annual reports by the usual suspects, consider that little of what you're being told can be tied to real people in real buildings executing real cyber-physical attacks. But there's one thing you can be sure to read in those reports, which brings us to the next insight. ICS threats are always exaggerated. If you haven't heard the phrase that ICS threats have increased dramatically, then you haven't been in OT security. If you were, you will have heard it for many years, over and over again. Yet here we are, around 30 years after the introduction of network-attached control systems, with a total of 2 successfully accomplished cyber-physical attacks on the global record, namely Stuxnet and the attacks in Ukraine, which I'm lumping together here, and 1 serious attempt, which would be the Triconex attack. The sober reality is that ICS threats are inflated for selfish reasons. OT security vendors and the media are using scare tactics as a marketing strategy. Media wants to get your attention, resulting in more clicks, resulting in more ad revenue. OT security vendors want you to buy their products, which is certainly totally legitimate. And they think that hyping up the threat increases the perceived value of these products. Unfortunately, scare tactics have become the predominant marketing strategy for OT security, if not for cybersecurity in general. But ask yourself, if ICS threats have grown so dramatically each and every year, how can it be that we haven't seen a proportional increase in actually accomplished cyber-physical attacks, or even in serious attempts like the Triconex attack? Wouldn't you expect to see at least random attack success, even by accident, because every dog has its day? Why is electricity still coming out of your power sockets? That is, if you don't happen to live in certain parts of California. And why do you still have drinking water? That just isn't logical if critical infrastructure would be under constant cyber attack by serious adversaries. And this sober observation costs us as the OT security community credibility every time the hype is perpetuated. Once decision makers start to suspect that the drama is all manufactured, they will stop to pay attention. Another and completely different motivation for the over-exaggeration of ICS threats is that you can later use it as an excuse in the rare event that you eventually do get hit after all. Because what can you do against these super hackers with unlimited capabilities? This is exactly the card that Schneider played after the Triconex attack.
You know, we believe, we see out of our analysis that the developers of this malware, the attackers in this situation had unlimited resources. They had a lot of skill, they had a lot of time, they had unrestricted access to develop this.
This takes us to insight number 3, which will blow your mind. Threat actor capability is not measured by headcount or funding, but by the efforts required to thwart an attack. This is somehow a continuation of the last point. Anytime you hear that an imagined potent adversary has unleashed their top hackers to attack America, it is implicitly assumed that they actually had the capability to pull it off with any reasonable chance of success. Maybe the best example for this is the constant over-exaggeration of Iran's offensive cyber capabilities. Just because a nation-state of decent size and with a stated objective, death to America, is after you, it doesn't mean that they can actually pull it off. Here is what it looks like when Iran hackers go after US critical infrastructure. They got caught in the attempt of cyber attacking a dam in New York. This is the dam. In other words, even if they had managed to gain total control over this poor excuse of a floodgate, which they hadn't, hardly would anybody even have noticed. Nevertheless, the event was totally blown out of proportion by a fear-mongering media. Same thing after the killing of Iran's beloved terrorist leader General Soleimani. CISA was frightened enough to issue a warning about incoming Iranian cyber attacks against US critical infrastructure. What really happened thereafter were defacements of a couple dozen US websites. Now let's be clear, if that's the best that Iran's cyber force can achieve 10 years after Stuxnet, we don't have to fear much. Let's revisit the Triconex attack in this context. Did the attackers really have unlimited resources and a lot of skill, as Schneider's Andrew Kling alleges? Well, obviously not, because the attack wasn't successful, and it's easy to see why. We are talking about cyber intruders experimenting on target, in this case in the process networks of a petrochemical facility in Saudi Arabia. This tells me that the attackers really didn't have their act together, apparently because they couldn't afford a realistic test environment for their lab. Unlimited resources, you tell us? And to see them experimenting with early-stage code on a triple redundant safety PLC tells me that they knew little to nothing about the functioning of safety equipment. A Triconex, like most safety PLCs, is like a raw egg when it comes to cyber. It executes a safe process shutdown at even the slightest hint of corruption, which is exactly what happened in this case and what blew the attack. Totally predictable. In order to fully appreciate what morons these attackers are, consider this. They have been able to penetrate deep into the networks of a petrochemical target in a foreign country, I assume. What they could have done is encrypt all files that they can access, particularly those on engineering stations, go home and extort $1 million ransom. Then invest in appropriate lab equipment, get your act together, and strike for real. But apparently that didn't occur to these amateurs. Long story short, the chance for success in this case was very low. The attackers were ill-prepared and could have been stopped much earlier by basic security controls such as proper network segregation and endpoint protection. Now here's the important point. How potent attackers are is not measured by their funding or backing, but by their demonstrated success, objective chance of success, and by the effort that is required to thwart the attack. A potent attacker is not a sweatshop with 100 or so hackers sitting in front of computer screens from 9 to 5. It's an entity that manages to breach and potentially take down a properly defended target. It doesn't matter how many talks a threat actor has given at Black Hat or which rank they held in Israel's Unit 8200. The only thing that matters is if they can penetrate your defenses, assuming that you have some. And that's probably the most practically useful takeaway that you can get from this video. Cyber attackers are only as potent as you allow them to be. They don't have magic powers. Proper implementation of even basic OT security controls raises required attacker capabilities exponentially. And it is left to debate whether ICS threat intel is necessary to establish a baseline cybersecurity capability that will keep the bulk of potential hackers at bay, particularly opportunistic bottom feeder ransomware operators that the average OT asset owner should be concerned about the most. So that is, in my opinion, what everybody should know about ITS threat intelligence. Let me know in the comments below what you think and share this video so that we can have a broad discussion.